Call came in at 0300 and I was already awake. That's the thing about deployment. Your body forgets how to sleep through the night. 18 months in Kandahar does something to your nervous system that no amount of therapy fully undoes. So when my phone lit up the ceiling of my childhood bedroom, I wasn't startled. I just rolled over and looked at the screen. It was my aunt, my mother's sister, the one who'd driven 4 hours to pick me up from Fort Bragg because nobody else had shown up. "Nora," she said, and her voice had that particular tightness I recognized from the day we buried my grandfather. "You need to come to the house. Your stepmother filed paperwork this morning. I don't know everything yet, but it's about your mother's estate." I sat up. Outside the window, the Carolina pines were perfectly still. "What kind of paperwork?" She was quiet for a moment. "A petition to remove you as beneficiary. She's claiming your mother wasn't of sound mind when she updated the will last year." I didn't say anything. I just sat there in the dark, in the bedroom I'd grown up in, listening to the hum of the refrigerator down the hall, thinking about how my mother had video called me from this very house 6 weeks before she died, clear-eyed, sharp, cracking jokes about my haircut and asking when I was going to give her a grandchild. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said. "My name is Nora Callahan. I'm 31 years old. I spent 8 years in the United States Army as a combat medic, 2 of those deployed overseas. I saved lives in conditions most people can't imagine. I came home to bury my mother, and then I came home again to find out that the woman my father had married 3 years after the divorce had spent the last 6 months of my mother's life maneuvering herself into a position to take everything. I want to tell you this story the way it actually happened, not the version my stepmother told the court, not the version my father's side of the family whispered at the funeral, the real one. Because the thing about being a soldier is that you learn early that the truth doesn't announce itself. You have to go looking for it, document it, protect it, and that's exactly what I did. My mother and father divorced when I was 16. It wasn't dramatic, or rather, it wasn't dramatic in the way people expect. No screaming, no thrown dishes. My father just stopped coming home for dinner, and then stopped coming home at all. And one afternoon, my mother sat me down at the kitchen table and told me, very quietly, that she and my father were separating. She poured herself a cup of coffee. She didn't cry. She asked me if I wanted grilled cheese for lunch. That was my mother, Lorraine Callahan. She handled things. She'd grown up poor in Eastern Tennessee, put herself through nursing school, raised me mostly alone even before the divorce because my father traveled constantly for work. She was not a woman who asked for help, and she was not a woman who complained. She was also, by the time she died at 63, not a woman without assets. The house was hers. She bought out my father's share in the settlement. She had a retirement account, a modest investment portfolio she'd built herself over 20 years of careful saving, and a life insurance policy that named me as beneficiary. None of it was a fortune. It was a nurse's life savings. But it was real, and it was hers, and she had been very deliberate about where she wanted it to go. My father remarried about 2 years after the divorce. I was already in basic training by then, so I only met his new wife. I'll call her my stepmother, though she was never anything resembling a mother to me. A handful of times over the years. She was pleasant enough at first, deferential in that particular way that doesn't quite feel genuine. She sent me a card when I deployed. I thanked her. That was the extent of our relationship. What I didn't know, what I only found out later, piece by piece, was what was happening at my mother's house during my last deployment. My mother was diagnosed with early-stage ovarian cancer in the spring of 2 years ago. She told me over video call, the same steady way she told me everything. She said the prognosis was cautiously optimistic. She said she had a good oncologist. She said she didn't want me to request early redeployment on her account. I asked her if she was sure. "Nora," she said, "I've been handling things since before you were born. Let me handle this." So, I stayed. I called her twice a week. I sent her a care package every month. Specific things she'd asked for: crossword puzzle books, the good dark chocolate, a heating pad for when the chemo made her joints ache. I have every one of those video calls saved. I have the receipts for every care package. I have the confirmation emails from the care coordination service I set up out of pocket so someone would check on her 3 times a week while I was gone. I have all of it. That matters. Remember that. What I didn't know was that during this time, my stepmother had begun inserting herself into my mother's life in ways that had nothing to do with kindness. My aunt told me later that it started with casseroles. My stepmother would show up at the house with food, offer to drive my mother to appointments when my aunt was working. It seemed generous. My mother, to her credit, was wary. She mentioned once in passing on a call that my father's wife had been coming around and she wasn't entirely sure why, but she didn't want to be uncharitable. Maybe she's just trying to do something decent, my mother said. My mother was a better person than most. What the casseroles were actually doing, I believe now, was establishing presence, establishing familiarity, getting her name into my mother's daily life in a way that could later be called a relationship. Because here is what my stepmother filed with the court 6 weeks after my mother's funeral, a petition claiming that my mother, in the last year of her life, had been subject to undue influence and cognitive decline, and that the changes she'd made to her estate documents 18 months before she died, which included updating her will to specify certain sentimental items for specific family members and updating the trust language to include a charitable donation to her hospital's oncology unit, were not made of her own free will. She wasn't claiming my mother's original will was invalid. She was claiming the updates were. And because the updates had clarified and reinforced my position as primary beneficiary, while adding the charitable component, invalidating them would send the estate into a murkier legal territory that her attorney was clearly prepared to exploit. She also filed a separate motion contesting the life insurance beneficiary designation. I sat at my aunt's kitchen table and read through the documents. It was early morning. My aunt had made coffee and gone into the other room because she said she couldn't watch my face while I read. I'm going to be honest with you. My first reaction was not anger. It was a kind of cold clarity, a narrowing. The same thing that happens in your body when a situation goes sideways in the field and you don't have time to feel anything yet. You just have to see. I saw several things very quickly. First, my stepmother's attorney had filed this within 6 weeks of the death, which suggested it had been prepared in advance. You don't retain a probate litigation specialist and draft a formal petition in 6 weeks. This had been planned. Second, the petition rested on the claim of cognitive decline, which meant someone had to testify to that decline, which meant there needed to be witnesses. And I knew, with everything in me, that my mother had been sharp and clear on every call we'd had right up until she went into hospice in her final 2 weeks. Third, I had proof. I called the JAG office at Fort Bragg that afternoon. The military's Judge Advocate General Court is available to service members for personal legal matters, and I want every veteran watching this to know that it is a resource, it is free, and it is staffed by people who are very good at their jobs. The JAG attorney I spoke with, a patient and precise woman who had clearly handled things like this before, walked me through exactly what I needed to do. She connected me with a civilian probate attorney in North Carolina who had worked with military families before, someone who understood what my documentation actually meant and how to use it. And then I got to work. The video calls were the foundation. I had 61 recorded calls with my mother over the course of my last appointment, spanning 14 months. The last call where she was fully herself, joking, sharp, asking questions about my unit and commenting on the news, was 11 days before she entered hospice. My attorney had a forensic specialist review a sample of the calls and provide an affidavit documenting her affect, her orientation to time and place, and the internal consistency of her memory across calls. The care package receipts and the care coordination service contracts established that I was actively involved in her care from 6,000 miles away. This mattered because part of my stepmother's implied narrative was that I had been absent, that she had stepped in because I wasn't there. The documentation showed that I had arranged professional support, had been in constant contact, and had discussed my mother's medical decisions with her directly on multiple occasions. My aunt provided a witness statement about the casserole visits and about a specific conversation she'd had with my mother approximately 8 months before the death, in which my mother had explicitly stated that she did not want my father's wife involved in her finances or medical decisions, and had asked my aunt to be her healthcare proxy, a role that was, in fact, documented in a separate legal instrument that predated my stepmother's involvement entirely. My mother's oncologist provided records. Her primary care physician provided records. Neither of them had documented any cognitive concerns. And then there was the deposition. My stepmother's attorney called a former neighbor as a witness, a woman who had lived 2 doors down and claimed to have observed my mother seeming confused on several occasions in her last year. The neighbor testified that my mother had once called her by the wrong name. My attorney asked her, quietly and without any particular drama, whether she was aware that my mother had mentioned in multiple documented communications that this neighbor reminded her strongly of her college roommate, with whom she'd had a falling out decades earlier, and that she sometimes experienced a kind of involuntary association when she saw her. The neighbor had no response to that. It wasn't confusion. My mother had told me about it on a call. She laughed about it. My stepmother took the stand herself. I sat at the plaintiff's table and I watched her, and I kept my expression exactly the way they teach you to keep your expression when something unexpected happens in a high-stress environment. Neutral, present, absorbing information. Her attorney asked her about her relationship with my mother. She described it warmly. She talked about the drives to appointments, the casseroles, the time she'd spent sitting with my mother in the living room. She said at one point that she'd been like a daughter to my mother in the final year. I heard someone behind me make a very small sound. I think it was my aunt. My attorney stood up for cross-examination. She asked my stepmother how many of my mother's medical appointments she had attended. My stepmother said she'd driven her to several. My attorney asked for specific dates. My stepmother could not provide them. My attorney produced the appointment records from the oncology center, which showed that my mother had been accompanied to appointments by my aunt, by a neighbor from her church, by a hired medical transport service I had arranged, and on 2 occasions by a friend from the hospital where she'd worked for 20 years. My stepmother's name did not appear in the visitor or accompanying party logs. She asked my stepmother whether she had ever been named as a contact on any of my mother's medical or financial accounts. The answer was no. She asked whether my stepmother had discussed with my father the potential financial outcome of contesting the will. My stepmother said that was a private marital matter. My attorney noted for the record that my father had declined to be deposed. And then she asked one more question. She asked my stepmother if she could explain why, 2 months before my mother died, and while my mother was still living at home, my stepmother had contacted a real estate agent about the property, not listing it, just inquiring about current market value in the neighborhood. The real estate agent had provided a statement. My stepmother looked at her attorney. Her attorney looked at the judge. The judge looked at my stepmother and told her she needed to answer the question. She said she'd just been curious. The judge was a woman in her early 60s with reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck. She had not, in the hours I'd sat in that courtroom, given any indication of what she was thinking. She took notes. She asked occasional clarifying questions. She was a complete professional. When she ruled from the bench. She did not delay to consider. She denied the petition to invalidate the estate updates. She denied the challenge to the life insurance beneficiary designation. She noted in her ruling that the evidence presented by the petitioner fell significantly short of establishing undue influence or diminished capacity, and that the evidence presented by the respondent, me, was, in her words, thorough, consistent, and credible. She also said something I wasn't expecting. She said that the court had an obligation to refer the matter to the state bar for review of the conduct of the petitioner's attorney, given certain procedural irregularities in how the petition had been filed and dated. I don't fully understand all the legal implications of that, but my attorney explained it to me in the parking lot afterward, and from the look on her face, I understood it was serious. I stood in the parking lot outside the Mecklenburg County courthouse in my civilian clothes. I'd chosen not to wear my uniform. Because I didn't want this to be about that, I wanted it to be about my mother, and my aunt hugged me for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "Your mother would have made a face at all of this." She was right. My mother would have found the whole thing exhausting and a little absurd. She would have made coffee and said something dry and moved on to the next thing. I did not speak to my father that day. He hadn't come to the courthouse. I don't know what that means, and I've stopped trying to figure it out. Some doors close gradually and some close all at once, and by the time the judge read her ruling, I understood that a door I hadn't quite admitted was closed, had been closed for a long time. The estate settled 4 months later. The house, my mother's retirement account, her investments, all transferred as she'd intended. The donation to the oncology unit at her hospital went through. I made sure of that first. I'm not telling you this story because I want sympathy. I have a job I'm proud of, a unit I trust with my life, and I'm doing fine. I'm telling you this because I think there are other people out there, people who are serving, people who are far from home, people who have been told in some form or another that their absence means they forfeit their place in their own families, who need to hear this. Document everything. Call your people as often as you can and keep those records. Know your legal resources, and do not let anyone rewrite the story of who was present and who wasn't, because presence isn't just physical. For 18 months, I was present in every way I could be from 6,000 miles away. My mother knew that. The judge saw it in the evidence. That was enough. I keep thinking about the parking lot, not the courtroom, not the ruling, not the moment my stepmother's attorney looked at the floor. Just the parking lot afterward. My aunt's arms around me, the November air, the sound of traffic on the street outside the courthouse like nothing had happened at all, like the world hadn't just finished trying to erase my mother. The thing I've learned about people who do what my stepmother did is that they count on you to be unprepared. They move quietly, they plan carefully, and they bet on the idea that grief will make you slow. That being far away means being out of the picture. That a daughter who spent 18 months in Kandahar couldn't possibly have 61 video calls saved to a hard drive organized by date with a forensic specialist ready to review them. She miscalculated who she was dealing with. But here's what I've sat with since then. The documentation alone didn't win this. Plenty of people have the receipts and still lose because having evidence and knowing how to use it are two different things. What actually protected my mother's wishes was a combination of things I'd been building for years without knowing I'd need them. The first was character. My mother raised me to do the right thing even when it costs you something. To show up. To keep your word. The care coordination service I set up before I deployed wasn't strategic. It was just what you do when someone you love is sick and you can't be there. I didn't document it because I was building a legal case. I documented it because I'm a medic and I track things. The integrity was there before the crisis arrived. That's the only reason it was useful when the crisis came. The second was clear thinking under pressure. I remember sitting at my aunt's table at 4 in the morning reading those court filings and feeling something settle in me instead of collapse. I'd been trained to assess, not react, to identify what I actually knew versus what I was assuming, to find the edges of a problem before I started solving it. That discipline, the kind you build over years, not days, was what let me see the petition for what it was and understand exactly where it was weak. The third was just not quitting. It would have been easier to contest nothing. Grief is exhausting. Litigation is exhausting. My stepmother probably counted on that too. But my mother spent 40 years working night shifts, studying on her lunch breaks, saving carefully, living honestly, and she deserved to have someone fight for what she built with the same stubbornness she'd used to build it. I'm not a perfect person. I've made mistakes in my life that I'm not proud of, but in this, I did not let her down. What I want you to take from this, if you take anything, is that the actions you take quietly, the calls you make, the records you keep, the promises you follow through on when no one's watching, those are the things that speak for you when you can't speak for yourself. My mother couldn't defend herself anymore, so everything she taught me and everything I'd quietly done right stood up in that courtroom and did it for her. That was enough. It was more than enough. It still is.